Okay. Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Daniel Ferraz. It's such an honor, such a pleasure to be with you guys from all over Brazil and hopefully also from Australia. And so we're about to start our one and only event of the second term. And I'd like to introduce you really fastly our project, all the events and the lives and the talks that we've done this year. And today, this talk with Alastair and Lynn Mario is going to close the year. Okay, so thank you all for being here with us. And let me share my screen here. It's going to be really fast at the stream. Yes. So, so this is our event today with Dr. Alastair Pennycook from the University of Technology, Sydney, and Mario Menezes de Souza from the University of São Paulo. And the topic is critical applied linguistics from the Global South. I'm Daniel Ferraz and Luciana Fonseca, my colleague here from USP, and also the coordinator of GEELLE, is going to help me moderate this chat, this talk. So this is our grupo de estudos sobre educação linguística em línguas estrangeiras, something like study group or research group on language education in foreign languages or in foreign language education. This is our email if you want to get in touch with us, geeleusp@gmail.com. So if you had a problem with the certificate, if you haven't received your certificate from tonight's talk with Lynn, Mario, and Alastair, please send us an email, okay? Also, this is our national project on literacies. This project was coordinated by professors Valkyria Montemor and Mario Menezes de Souza from 2009 and 2020, and is being coordinated now from 2021 to 2025 by me and my colleague Ana Paula Duboc from the University of São Paulo. This is our website. So GEELLE and the National Project on Literacies, they are like dialoguing. They are co-partners, let's say, two projects here from USP. So as I told you, Luciana and I are moderating this chat. It's like a chat-like event, as you know. And these are the events that we have organized so far. So we had one event in Portuguese and another event in English, an international event. This one was about teacher education in times of pandemic, okay? In February, the second event, we had Robert Mitzi and Joe Window talking about queer theory education and language education. And I'm showing you this, especially for those who have never been here with us. So please watch the videos on YouTube. This one was about internationalization and teacher education, research projects and practices in the areas of German, French, and English, okay, in Portuguese. This one was in Portuguese as well. Teacher education in the middle of pandemic, the contributions of the Spanish area, okay, with Adrian, Isadora, and Livia. And I'll be very fast, but of course you can go to our YouTube channel. This one was with Gabriela Veronelli and Ana Paula Duboc talking about decoloniality in language teacher education. This one was in English. And then in May, we had Professor Lemario and Jan Machelin talking about teachers as invisible victims of COVID and youngsters longing for school in COVID time. So it was another event in English, okay? And then in May, we talked about autoethnography in teacher education, mirrors, innovations, and emotions, okay? And then in May, number 3, we had Bill Cope, Mary Calances, and Valkyria Montemor talking about literacies in times of pandemic. So you see that pandemic was our focus because many teachers in Brazil were struggling, you know, especially with this pressure overnight to turn everything online, right? Remote emergency, remote teaching online. This one was about language education and anti-racist teacher education. All right, it was a very interesting one in June. We had the second one in English in June, talking about images, visual literacies, and race in teacher education with Professor Dimandi and Professor Mizan. In July, we had translation and teacher education and dialogue. Okay, this one in Portuguese. And this one, another one in Portuguese, talking about translingual practices in teacher education with Cláudia Rocha and Roberval Maciel. And in August, we had Elisa Alencar and Letícia Carvalho talking about the encounter between languages and literatures in teacher education. And that was it. What we're doing today, we thought about these 10 minutes of my introduction. And then for part one, we have questions from GEELLE members to Alastair and then Mario. So these were some of the questions, some of them very introductory questions, let's say, because as we know, our audience, they are from school teachers, pre-service teachers to researchers already. And while we're doing part one, I'd like you to make comments and ask questions for Alastair and Lynn, any link that you can make. Vocês podem fazer perguntas em português, ok? Comentários em português que a gente vai traduzir, or you can ask questions in English or make comments in English or in Spanish and Espanol, and we will translate them to Alastair and to Lynn. And then part two, we move on to the questions from YouTube chat. Okay? So this is it. So now I have the honor to welcome Mario, Alastair, and Luciana. Let me call all of them to the screen. Lynn, Alastair, Luciana, thank you very much for being here with us. And it's an honor for us to welcome you guys at GEELLE. And just to let you know that all of these events that we've done so far, they were all chat-based, let's say. We had questions for our speakers, let's say, and asked them to interact with the audience, with the teachers from all over Brazil. Okay? So thank you very much. I really don't need to read your curriculum because it's really, really not necessary. But I don't know if you have some initial comments, Lynn, Alastair.
It's just to say it's a pleasure to be here and to engage once more again with Alastair. And let's take it from here.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Okay. Lou, would you like to start?
Sure. So good evening, everyone. Good morning, everyone else. It's lovely to be here. We'll start with the questions from the GEELLE group, and the first question that the group members posed was for Alastair and Lynn. Could you talk about your collaborations, Lynn, from the point of view of your collaboration with Australian colleagues and scholars, and Alastair about your collaborations with Brazilian scholars? And let's see who would like to go first.
Alastair, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. And thank you again to Daniel and Luciana for this invitation. This is nice to do. Of course, I'd rather be in Brazil, maybe, but it's good we can do this. So this first question, I was thinking about a bit. In one way, I think for a lot of us that were reading critical literacy, critical pedagogy, through the works of Paulo Freire, we always thought Brazil was a place you needed to engage with, right? This was always there in stuff we were reading, and some of the context of that work was always a part of what we did. But that was sort of in a general sense. The first time I started collaborating, in fact, came to Brazil, was Lynn Mario invited me in 1997, I think, to a conference in Belo Horizonte. And that was my first time to come to Brazil. And I came some long route to Sao Paulo and stayed with Lynn Mario, and then we went up to Belo Horizonte. And that was the first time I was there. And since then, I've had a lot of contact with other people. I think Luis Paulo, Moita Lopez invited me to Rio. And then more recently, we've had the group around Kleber Silva in Brasilia, looking at critical applied linguistics. So it's been a long collaboration. And for me, it's been, one of the most important I've had, because I realized that the work I was doing resonated so much in Brazil, right? That I think it was partly because work we were doing was drawing on Freire and a particular critical tradition, and I'd sort of thought about that, was writing it, and as I wrote, various things I wrote, and when I got invited to speak in Brazil, I realized, people are saying, this is right, in a way that, in ways in other parts of the world, people go, okay, critical, this and that's okay, it's useful. In Brazil, I thought, actually, this is where, I have one of the most receptive audiences, and where I kind of learn the most. I kind of get to talk to people, and, you don't have to convince people I've talked to, we need to have a critical perspective. They say, of course, like, what else are you going to do? Of course we need a critical, and of course it's not true that everyone does, and you realize that I was introduced to a particular group of people who were already strongly, engaged with a critical perspective. But to me, that's been, and I suppose, if I take it from that time when Lynn Mario first invited me to come, that's 24 years ago or so, it's been a long-term engagement. And of course, not only in Brazil, I see Lynn Mario around, in Norway or all sorts of places. We meet and we talk, and a lot of other people from Brazil. We've met at a lot of other places. But it's been, for me, a very long-term and a very fruitful, probably the most important engagement I've had, really, with all this, the critical work that feeds into my work, and that seems to give me a useful context to talk and I learn from. So to me, it's been long and very fruitful engagement.
Yes. Lynn, before I pass on to you, Alastair, every time we present something, or even here in Brazil, they say, well, this is the land of Paulo Freire. So
yes.
We are always under this pressure, But I do think that this national project on literacies that I just presented, that was coordinated by Lynn and Valkyria, and now kind of in charge of it, this is something that the critical ideas, they have been very, very fruitful. Yes, Lynn?
Yeah, and now we have to be critical of the critical, right?
Of course.
Because as you know, my more recent work, this is the year of the centennial of Paulo Freire. And it's also, the last 2 years have been years of increasing interest in post-colonial theory, and so this, in decolonial theory, or in the plural, decolonial theories. And this has provoked me to reread Freire critically. But first, answering the question of this long-term collaboration, as Alastair mentioned, when I was president of Empuli, which then became the CBLA, which it now is, and that was the first time that Alastair came to Brazil, and at the time people were beginning to read Alastair, so that was very significant, Alastair's coming to Brazil. But I personally, the question with Australia, I have family, uncles and aunts in Australia, so my connection with Australia goes further back, and I've had the opportunity. I've seen Alastair in Australia on more than one occasion, right, Alastair? But I've had the occasion of working with other Australian colleagues as well, such as Ilana Snyder at Monash, and where I spent a couple of months in 2010, and Anne Hickling at the University of Brisbane, and I think she may have retired now. And also in 2007 with Vanessa Andreotti, we spent some time with an indigenous community in Uluru. And that research gave rise to that publication we had, that anti-racist pedagogy, which we called Through Other Eyes. So Australia has been quite significant in my work. Well, Alastair specifically, I'm grateful to Alastair for even informal collaborations, because it was through one of Alastair's invitations in 2004, when I was doing a postdoctorate at University of Western Ontario in London, Ontario. And Alastair, you invited me to the AAAL in, where was it at the time? In Portland. And it was there that, through you, I met Sinfri Makoni and Suresh Kanagaraja, with whom I also developed collaborations over the years. So, in terms of my particular research, it was also very important to me, because I don't say this in public very often in Brazil, but there was this very disciplinarian, very normative focus in applied linguistics in Brazil. Probably still is, but not solely so. And I was doing my research on what I then called indigenous literacies. And I was coming from a background of post-colonial theory and discourse analysis. And the reaction I received, and I hope the young people who are listening now can learn from this, the reaction I used to receive from colleagues at the time was that, pare com essa coisa de índio, or stop that thing with it. People were just, in applied linguistics, were not interested in anything related to indigenous communities. Now here I'm talking about what, more than 20 years ago, and we can see the result of this until today in the relationship, this totally negative relationship our government still has with indigenous communities, right? And that was, for me, was very frustrating, because every time I tried to talk about my research in applied linguistic fora, at conferences in Brazil or in roundtables, my colleagues would say they had an allergy to this. They wanted me to speak, but on my other research, not on my indigenous research. And that was why I found that abroad, people are more interested in what I had to say in my indigenous research, because it wasn't about indigenous communities. It was about challenging concepts of literacy, especially Eurocentric concepts of literacy, which I still do, as you know, Danielle, right? That for me was what it was about, challenging concepts of language and literacy, which through me, I discovered through working with indigenous communities. But there was so much in applied linguistics in Brazil, perhaps there still is, I don't know, I haven't felt it. There was so much resistance, and I would say even discrimination against anything to do with indigenous languages or literacies, that really I felt more, my work had a greater reception outside the country than inside the country. A sad truth, I couldn't have, my interlocutors in applied linguistics were outside the country. It's really sad, where inside the country at the time, people were still working with what the British Council had to say on ESP and you know, all of that stuff there. And the British Council was still investing heavily. And me as a British citizen, I was working against this. Oh, well, so, you know, I'm grateful to Alastair for his initial interlocution in all of this. And he perhaps doesn't realize how he was instrumental in helping me further my research in in applied linguistics.
Thank you, Lynn. Lou, let me just, sorry, before the next question. Lynn and Alastair, so all the comments that I'm controlling, I'm here organizing the chat, and something that we do here, let me tell the audience, the text and everything that you comment, we will send by email to everybody. And one of the texts that, the one on multimodality literacy of the Kaxinawa, this is something that we can send to everybody. It's a text you wrote in 1994. It's one of my favorites. So I will send to everybody so that they can have an idea. It's not an exceptional text, but it's a very important one. So I will send to everybody that has registered for this event. So let everybody know that all the text that we mentioned and everything we'll send by email later on, okay? Sorry, Lou.
It's okay. I'd just like to pick up on something both of you mentioned in your responses. The word critical, right? In a critical way. And I would like to encourage you to elaborate on this, right? And Lynn specifically said, you are reading Paulo Freire critically today, right? And Alastair also used the term, and I know that he problematizes the term considerably in his works. So if you could expand on that, Alastair, would you like to go?
Yeah, look, and that links to some of the other questions that were raised ahead of time. I mean, the term critical is sort of necessary and problematic, right? And one of the difficulties I had, and one of the questions that came sort of pointed to the fact that I think in about 10 years ago, I was saying, maybe it's time to give it up, which I didn't, but I was sort of thinking about it because, and particularly if you're writing about critical literacy or critical applied linguistics, one of the problems is that you're kind of always making this division with what isn't critical, and that in a sense it's necessary because and I keep going back and forth and trying to argue my way around this, but there's no way out of it. I think that if you say this is critical work, you're kind of saying something isn't, right? And of course one of the problems is that the critical is sort of in a general sense what most academics feel they want to be, right? They're saying, of course I'm critical, right? Because there's a general sense which is critical in terms of looking skeptically, investigating, reading closely, and there's a critical distance, right? The idea that a sort of neutrality is seen as critical, right? So there's all sorts of meanings of critical, and it's quite difficult to work with that and to be doing so by arguing stuff isn't critical. At the same time, I keep thinking, yeah, but we have to keep the critical project going, and that's also to keep bringing it back to saying this isn't just critical as in critical thinking, critical distance. This is critical with a political edge, right? This is critical that says, let's name the problems that as we see them, racism, gender inequality, a whole range of social issues. So this has to be part of our work, right? And it can be the sort of critical work, I mean, that Lynn was just talking about with indigenous people. Part of that, as he was saying, it was to unravel Western-centric or Northern views of literacies. At the same time, is to kind of challenge what was going on in terms of in Brazil about why wasn't stuff being done, worked with, and carefully worked with indigenous people in Brazil. And so it's always got these epistemological and political agendas. And it's always difficult. I mean, because I gave a talk at the ILA conference, because, in terms of the critical, I've been revisiting it, and I've just done a second issue of my critical applied linguistics book, because in the end I thought, okay, let's actually regenerate. And it was part of that comes from, again, people in Brazil. We had the critical applied linguistics conference in Brasilia, and I said, okay, stop worrying, let's just go and let's make critical applied linguistics better. And so I did a second edition of my book, which was interesting and much more difficult than I thought, because I realized there's so much work actually I had to kind of bring in and change the way I was doing things. But it's interesting now I'm dealing with a kind of senior figure in our field, listened to my talk and then wrote to me and said, I've got problems with this, and is writing a response to that now. And he generously kind of sent me his text, right? But it's basically saying, we've been doing, what about bilingual education, right? We've been doing critical work for decades, going back to the 60s, supporting bilingual education. And I'm trying to say, okay, but support for bilingual education is not in itself a critical project, right? So it depends, like, for what, right? And we can see that with some of the stuff coming out from Ophelia Garcia and others in New York, saying just because we got bilingual education doesn't make it critical. But again, we get back to that problem of, I don't want to get stuck in too many arguments saying this is critical, that's not. But at the same time, I want to say, but you can't just say it's critical just because it's supporting bilingualism because we think bilingualism is good. I said that kind of supports a liberal, inclusive agenda, which is nice and it's important, but it's not critical with a stronger political edge. And that's the sort of tension we always have. There's many sides to criticality, and by naming work as critical, it's always a kind of partly exclusive move to say this is critical, that isn't. And for some people that doesn't matter, and for others it does, right? And I think it's a difficult space, but we need to have the critical there. And after I had my doubts for a while, thinking we've overused the term critical discourse, critical literacies, I think, is it really interestingly critical? Then I thought, actually, no, let's go back and have another go and reassert the agenda and see if we can make it work again, keep it going, because I think there's so much need for it. And actually, I found there seems to be a resurgence right now, different parts of the world saying, let's absolutely get a stronger critical agenda going because we need it. So that's you were never going to get a short answer to the critical. So.
Of course not. Yes, thank you so much. Lynn, would you like to add to that?
Yes, certainly. Now here's my not short answer.
And maybe expand on critically reading Paulo Freire today as well.
I think in the humanities we have inherited our interest in the critical from a Marxist influence that we've had, whether we like it or not, in since the post-war period. And I always like to come back and reflect on Horkheimer's concept of critical theory. Max Horkheimer from the Frankfurt School, his concept of critical theory in opposition to what he called traditional theory. So where for him traditional theory was a reflection on the status quo, to understand and give value to tradition, and how tradition is the foundation of the community we have at present. So traditional theory is interested in conserving the status quo, in understanding where the status quo comes from, its benefits, and the importance of maintaining it. In opposition to that, he says critical theory is a theory which questions the status quo and aims at transforming and changing the status quo. Right? So these two things for me are important when we talk about critique, because it became popular in the West to understand critique as always something which moved towards change, right? But then exactly what change are we talking about? And that becomes, it's very often we had change for change's sake and critique for critique's sake or whatever. But then from that tradition of Horkheimer's making this distinction between critical and traditional theory, we also have, from hermeneutic theory, we have all of that. From philosophies, we have also inherited the concept that critique is suspicion. This is also has its origin in Marxist theory, right? Where the idea of ideology was false consciousness. So we have to, it is, as Marxist critiques, we have to give a truer view of reality and not a false view of reality. So this led various philosophers who were influenced by this position to reflect on critique as suspicion, right? So we always have to be suspicious because there may always be a hidden meaning, right? And it's important to go, and this was what close reading was all about, to go beyond the surface and look at, you know, the subterranean labyrinth behind the text and what the text really wants to say, but what it doesn't, right? This is all very well. And for a long time, yes, I was also part of this tradition until I began to question, you know, the concept of traditional and the concept of critique for transformation. So whose tradition are we talking about? And here, in terms of language or sociolinguistics and applied linguistics, now, and when I read people like the Indian sociolinguist Lakshman Kupchandani, you know, where he says that the view, unfortunately, he laments this. Unfortunately, the dominant views of language in linguistics are Eurocentric views, which through colonization have been universalized or globalized or spread everywhere. So these European views of language are, he says, based on the European experience of language, which is monolingualism, right? So even if it's not de facto or real monolingualism, and we go back to the origins in Europe of the nation in the 18th century, the nation was connected to, right, the one singular view of reality, generally the bourgeois view of reality, and the bourgeois view of language was, this was the source of whatever became the national language, etc., etc. So this singularity, when I say monolingual, I mean a view of singularity as norm, as becoming normative, is part of the European experience, right? This doesn't mean that in Europe all languages only have singular forms. No, this is what the dominant perspective was, right? Now, when the dominant perspective in other regions which are endemically multilingual, like Africa and Asia, and this is what Kupchandani was talking about, he said, you know, we can't, in India, you can't, looking at language from a monolingual point of view doesn't make sense, right? So we don't learn language as a system or as a norm and then use it. Most people in India are born multilingually. They speak many languages, and they learn how to speak these languages without using names. So they move from one language to another without realizing that these are necessarily different units or different systems. And they learn this through practice and depending on their interlocutors, who they're speaking to, for what objectives, etc. Right? So instead, in opposition to the European view of language, which is top down, the nation, the norm, the national language down, which generates this image of monolingualism, from, let's say, an Asian or African perspective, we don't have a single language claiming to represent the whole national reality. So it's got nothing to do with representation. It's got to do with practice, or praxeology, if you like, right? It's got to do with communicating in practice. It's got to do with connecting with other people within your community, because everyone in your community in a place like India is also multilingual, right? So it's bottom up, in opposition to the monolingual concept of language in Europe. In India, it's bottom up. So now in India, going back to Horkheimer's view of traditional theory and critical theory, in India, if we want to think of a theory that will maintain the system as it is and understand it, right, then what could be critical for Europe may be traditional for India, right? And whereas if we look at multilingualism from an Indian perspective, which is bottom-up, praxeological, based on interaction, from a European point of view, it would suggest change, right? So these things, from whose perspective are we looking at language? So for me, became very important when in my research on post-colonial theories and things like going back to Edward Said's Orientalism, when Edward Said was talking about criticizing the fact that how Europeans represented the East. He was not saying there was a real representation of the East or an authentic representation of the East. He was calling attention to the fact that representation is always situated, right? So our concepts of language are always situated. Right? And I think for me, this situatedness is what needs to be part of our critique, and not an objectivity or a neutrality or a distance. I think it's an awareness of situatedness, and something which, what's his name, Rothberg, I forget, is it Michael Rothberg? Are you familiar with his work, Alastair? Recently, he calls the implicated subject. He does work on post-colonial theory and Holocaust theory. And he developed this notion of the implicated subject, which for me is very, very important in decolonial theory, which doesn't talk about it. But I tend to contaminate one theory with another. And in the idea of the implicated subject is we as subjects, discourse analysis could also explain this. We as subjects are not necessarily or personally responsible for the way, for the system of which we form part, but we are definitely implicated in the system and therefore responsible. Right? So here, when he, in terms of Holocaust theory, just because you are not involved in decimating a population, it doesn't mean that you are not part of that process. If you were part of that nation and you lived in that nation, you were also implicated in that process. So it's like in racism in Brazil, and this is what I've been insisting on recently. Racist is not a person, right? It's not, in Brazil we like to say we're not racist, but we are, because we are part of a racist history, right? Slavery was abolished legally in Brazil, but never in practice. There was never any compensation paid to slaves, right? So it's almost as if overnight, the people who enslaved other human beings simply stopped enslaving them and nothing ever happened to them, right? So all their attitudes, which naturalize this process of enslaving other human beings, these attitudes that human beings can be objects and susceptible to be treated as inferior and exploited. This continues in our way of thinking in Brazil. And we see this in our, as an example, we see this in our labor laws at present in Brazil, right? Which are all in favor of the employer. Right? So for me, this is a reflection of the racism in which we are all implicated subjects in Brazil. And for me, this is critique, right? And coming back just to, I said, it's a long, short answer, but Luciana, you asked me to go back to my comment on Freire. Okay, it's got everything to do with this, because as you know, Freire began in his Pedagogia do Oprimido, began from a Marxist perspective where in reflecting on social justice in society, he took social class as his category of analysis, right? And all his pedagogy is based on social class, all of it, right? So he talks about the peripheral, the marginal, right? The urban poor, right? And he makes no distinctions between race, gender. None of these distinctions are present in Freire. So Freire's critique is a critique which has been stuck in time, right? And now reading Freire, when I say I go back and I'm reading Freire from rereading Freire from a decolonial point of view, and what decolonial theory makes us very much aware of is our situatedness, right? The fact that we are, and I call this bringing the body back into the picture, right? The fact that when we're reading or speaking, we are bodies, and in the sense that we are bodies, we are occupying space, and because we are bodies who live, who have a life history, a life experience, these are bodies that undergo change. So all the discourses that traverse our understanding, in our learning, in our speaking, are multiple discourses which occupy the same space that we occupy. So we come under their influence. These are multiple discourses which traverse our bodies, but there are also discourses which, like our bodies, change in time. So I think we have to avoid the trap of falling into what many people in Brazil recently fall into when they talk about local de fala, right? This is my place. This is the place from which I'm speaking, as if it's something fixed and concrete and substantial. No, it changes, right? It undergoes change. It undergoes contamination. It's these dynamics which are important. And I think Freire, obviously, he was writing in a different time, right? But we aren't. We are not reading Freire at the time that he was writing, right? And if one thing we've learned from Freire is that he makes this distinction of estar no mundo, estar com o mundo. So being in the world and being with the world. This is important here, and this makes a contribution to in the world. Is this what I mentioned? Being in our bodies, in the world. So I'm speaking to you all here, in the world, one body to another, right? We're occupying the same space at the moment, but we are also with worlds. Now here we are with different worlds because we bring to this conversation our different life experiences, our different learnings, our different ideologies, if you like, right? And so in our exchanges, these two things of being in the world and being with the world come into interplay, and this is what we have to take into account. Now, Freire wasn't interested in this dynamic. No, and I think now, as we are reading Freire from the 21st century, right, where we're reading Freire having read decolonial theory, we have to stop reading Freire as we read Freire 30 years ago. When Freire makes a distinction between epistemologies which are rigorous and scientific and epistemologies of the poor, which are not rigorous, which are, what he says, very much limited to the concrete, as if these people are only capable of thinking of their immediate needs and what's concrete to them, as if they're not capable of abstract thinking, right? So Freire makes this distinction between the pedagogue who is capable of rigorous scientific epistemology versus the peripheral learner who is dominated by only common sense, only by concrete thinking, right? And for me, this is highly discriminatory now, looking at it. So who decides what is rigorous and abstract thinking, right? And I think it's time for us to stop just repeating and reproducing Freire. Minimally, at least, let's say, from where we are reading Freire, and understand that Freire is writing from a particular perspective, his perspective in the 60s, in the 70s. You know, if we look at Freire in his last writings, for example, in Pedagogia da Esperança, I don't know if this has been translated into English, the Pedagogy of Hope.
Pedagogy of Hope, yeah, I think so.
He is reflecting, in that book, he's reflecting on his first book, Pedagogia do Oprimido. And there we see a shift in his thinking, right? So if he's capable of making that shift, we have to as well, right? So I think it's time for us to stop putting Freire on a pedestal as if he is, I mean, there's nothing worth criticizing in Freire. There is, we learn from it. We're not destroying Freire as our government tries to do. No, we are learning from Freire as we're learning from everything always, because we are always situated. And I think the important thing for me for critique at the moment is also taking into account the planet. We cannot possibly, Alastair has written about post-humanism. I think we cannot possibly talk about critique at the moment without taking into account that we're living under threat of having no food or water or even a planet to live on. Right? That is something we have to take into account. And that means two things in terms of critique for me. Sorry if I'm going on too long, I'm finishing. Two things. Being aware of what is popularly being called relativism, and what we learn from post-colonial or decolonial theory and what we can call relationality, right? Relativism is saying that if we have different opinions, we have a right, and this is the liberal aspect, each of us has an equal right to our opinions, right? So we have to agree to disagree, right? For me, this is, excuse the word, crap, right? We agree to disagree when the opinions of some could mean our destruction or our elimination. So we don't have equal, our opinions are not equal because their consequences may be drastically different, not only on the lives of certain communities, but on the life of the planet, therefore on all of us. Right? So we have to understand relationalism or relationality, the fact that we all learn from each other. Right? None of us is an independent totality. We're all interconnected. We all learn from each other. And what Isabel Stanger says, we occupy the same cosmos, right? What unites us is this space which we have in common in concrete terms, but which we don't have in common in terms of ideas, right? So we have to learn to coexist, even disagreeing with each other, because if our disagreement can result in harm or hurt to others, then it's not something that contributes to our coexistence. And these are things which we have to take into account in critique, and especially when we are talking about language education.
Lynn, Mario, you have answered all of our 6 questions. Okay, so I'd like to tell you that. Lou, we have to eliminate question 6, for example. So Lynn, first of all,
no, but Alastair hasn't. So.
No, can you send me the later on the reference of Rothberg, please?
Yeah.
And also what I was going to say,
subject. Yeah, sure.
The implicated subject. And also, this is something that connects with what Alastair has just said. This whole debate on critique is a paradox for me. We need it, and it's really, really relevant. At the same time, we need to contextualize it, like socio-historically, that we have to do with Freire, with 100 years, and we see all of these events going on, and some maybe not with this view that you're bringing, right? Lou, sorry, question 2, move on, sorry. If you want to join us, Lou, in the debate.
No, I'm fine. I was just saying that Lynn Mario makes the life of interviewers very easy. So, because you just pick up from one point to the other, and they're all very interconnected. So it's fascinating. But I will pose another question from our group, and one of them, of course, you have hinted on this, both of you, but the member of the groups are interested in what are your current research interests and what should applied linguistics be concerned with? And of course, you've hinted on this, but I guess it would be nice to listen to more. Alastair?
Oh, it's me. Yes. I was just before I do that, I was also interested in I mean, in a lot of ways in what Lynn Mario was just saying, but I was reminded too with the this idea of the implicated subject that we did a panel. I think you pre-recorded it. It was probably at TSOL, maybe it was at TSOL or something, but on complicity. And we, that we actually did it was kind of some kind of invited panel on complicit, and I thought actually it is another. It's a very related term to that, and it's another theme we need to go back and explore. Right, exactly that. To say, yeah, what are we constantly complicit, and it's the same kind of issue we have to address, I think. So the question of current research. So I'm, as I said, I spent part of last year reworking my critical applied linguistics book. I just thought in the end that was a project worth doing, and it needed a lot of updating and gave me a chance to do a lot of reading. And though I was having to do it in lockdown, so we're limited to ways we can find stuff at certain periods, right? So I've been working on that, and that's meant sort of more work around the ideas of critical applied linguistics. And I've been working that just before that, I was working with Symphony Marconi on the book on applied linguistics from the Global South. And since like all those projects keep going, right? Because we keep writing, we just did there's a new edition, and it's very interesting actually. There are too many handbooks in the world, right? But it was like the Routledge Handbook of Multilingualism, which was, I think, came out about 2010 or something, and was, but kind of edited and focused in a lot of ways, sort of a global North view of multilingualism, right? And they're doing a second edition, but the editors have changed, and they're actually in South Africa, and at least one is, I forget when, it's certainly in South America, not Brazil. And they've shifted. They're saying, let's look at multilingualism differently. So Marconi and I we already wrote a chapter in the original one, kind of disinventing multilingualism or whatever, but we've tried to rework that quite a lot to rethink. And I think it's one of the exciting things. We're seeing this shift of, we can get back to Global South and decolonial theory and the problems with it and difficulties, but it's a kind of movement that's happening now, and it's requiring people to reorient from the South and to rethink, and it's shifting who's editing, it's shifting who's writing. So I've been kind of I'll keep working with Marconi on stuff, multilingualism, and we've got ongoing projects around multilingual workplaces. We've got data still we're working on from that I work with Emi Otsuji and so on. What else? I've got a kind of range of projects. They just they continue in a sense. I've got a few ideas I'm thinking on. I'm not quite sure whether I'm going to take them up. Some quite difficult things about writing about ontologies and language ontologies. I might try and do, or I might just not do because it's difficult. But I'm ongoing projects around that of multilingualism, rethinking from the South, critical work, and so on.
Thank you. Lynn?
Yeah, well, my current research is similar. I'm looking, as I said before, for me, what's important in looking at language from a Southern perspective or from a decolonial perspective, and I'd like to remind our listeners here that there are loads of decolonial theories, right? Don't think that decolonial theories, don't think of it in the singular, like applied linguistics, right? Decolonial, what we are familiar with as decolonial theory is Latin American decolonial theory, which is different to African decolonial theory, which is different to what in India they call decolonial theory, or what even in Eastern Europe they're calling decolonial theory, right? But perhaps what all of these have in common is, I've already mentioned the fact that they recuperate the idea that we construct meaning always from a located, situated perspective. So we're always, meaning doesn't come top down. It always starts from where we are located and our particular histories and the discourses that traverse us. Right? So, Now, what I'm working on at the moment is looking for new vocabulary, new metaphors, new language to think about language. Right. So, I mean, there's been, together with the decolonial fashion, let's say, there's also been the translinguistic fashion. Right. So, going from previously talking about variation in relation to a norm, now we talk about repertoires. Right. And what bothers me a little bit is that when we talk about repertoires, we have to remember that repertoires also vary. Our concept of repertoire varies according to our context, our situatedness. So most people who look at translanguaging, they look at repertoire in terms of verbal repertoires, right? I think we have to, in Asia and Africa, the non-verbal repertoire is equally important, right? So things like silence in India, it's so common because people are multilingual and they don't share all their languages in common. So it's very common to come across situations where you don't share the same linguistic resources as the interlocutor. So you use other non-verbal semiotic resources. So I think we have to, repertoire is not cannot be taken for granted. That term needs to be questioned, not only in terms of verbal language and non-verbal language, but also question repertoire in terms of, from a philosophical aspect of, are all of these elements that constitute a repertoire, do they all have the same value? Right? So can we say it's going back to, in the 1980s when we talked about difference and diversity, we tended to think of diversity as simply a quantification of differences, and this generated things like Vertebrecht's concept of superdiversity, right? There may be things which are different, where there may be repertoires which are not seen, right? And this is the ontological aspect comes in. Repertoires which are invisibilized, whose existence is denied, therefore the ontological aspect. And so if we generalize the term and we make it easy, repertoires, right? Or in multiliteracies now we talk about repertoires and then design, right? I think we need to problematize the concept of repertoire. And what I'm working on, looking at, together with my work on anti-racism in Brazil, the concept of the quilombo. And if you remember in Brazilian history, the quilombo was a place where escaped slaves went to, right? Generally in isolated areas where they could feel safe, and where there was not a pre-established community. So a community had to be formed. The only thing they had in common was they had escaped from oppression, right? So they had to create something in common, but that whatever they created in common was not a top-down normativity. It was a living together with their differences. So if I take this, the metaphor of the quilombo as a space which brings together different forms, different people, different languages, from which they can speak and act, but which is not necessarily the same thing for all of them. Right? I think this gives us a different metaphor of language other than norm or not norm, other than norm or repertoire, right? So if we can think of language as a particular constitution of language, contextual constitution of language, in terms of an agglomeration, not just a repertoire of equally valid and items, but as particular conglomerations or agglomerations of semiotic and linguistic repertoires, and from which they can act, because this was the objective of the quilombo. It was to give them a space, a safe space. And I don't know. I'm working on this. I'm thinking aloud. Right?
Can I say? I mean,
Of
I
course.
was thinking. I forgot to mention that I'm one of the other ideas I've been working with a lot is the idea of assemblage.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that fits quite nicely with maybe or maybe not. Maybe you can comment on that. But the sort of idea Lynn was just saying, the idea of assemblage gives us another way of talking about that, of this sort of coming together of different elements in a moment, and how they kind of relate to each other. And it's, it's got its problems too, but it's quite a productive way of thinking. And there's kind of a lot of work going on in different fields around the idea of assemblage. I'm finding quite useful. So I've been using that quite a lot to talk about the same kind of things, I think, that Lynn was trying to get at there. Yeah.
Lynn, have you found the new terms, the new vocabulary? Because we're very curious.
No,
to know.
With the people I've been coming into contact with, these are non-academics. For example, a Brazilian non-academic thinker of the quilombos, as you know, is Antonio Bispo, right? And Alastair, you probably wouldn't have heard of him because he's a member of a quilombo in the northeast of Brazil, and he was the only member of the community who was sent to school outside the quilombo because they needed someone who could read and write in the community, right? And so he doesn't publish, but he speaks a lot. The only work he has published was published, in fact, by other people, more like transcriptions of what he said. But he uses two notions which are interesting. One is confluence, and he always uses this in reflections on the land. Confluence and transfluence. So confluence is a coming together, but not so he says rivers come together, right? But they don't come together and become one, right? So confluence, unfortunately, ends up becoming where we reduce variation to the same thing. We reduce difference to sameness, right? So he contrasts confluence with transfluence. So confluence is what happens to rivers where different tributaries flow into one, but each of them has their own characteristics and their own terrains, right? Some more drought-stricken than others. And he uses the concept of what he calls transfluence. So for him, transfluence is the idea where does the rain come from? The rain comes from the rain doesn't just feed into the rivers, but the rain comes from the condensation and the humidity which came from different rivers. So the rain we cannot say this rain comes from this river or that river, right? So he uses these things in a way similar to what you mentioned as assemblage, Alastair, to say that between confluence and transfluence, we have this dynamic of what it means to live in a quilombo.
Mm-hmm. Right. Lynn, Alastair, we're doing the last question of GEELLE members because we have so many questions from the YouTube chat. And I'd like to thank everybody. We have the whole country here, Alastair. People from Bahia, from everywhere. I don't want to be, I'm not going to mention all of them because I would have to mention. So thank you all guys for being here. The last question from GEELLE would be, Alastair and Lynn, could you tell us about how you see the political situation in your context? Maybe globally, I don't know. What are the roles of language education in such contexts? I know you kind of touched, but I'd like to know from you this political, because we've been doing a lot of studies in terms of the relationship between language and politics and language, and how the role is, I know it's such an unfortunate term, but the roles of language education into all this. Alastair?
This could, okay, I'm trying to think how not to make this really long, but I mean, I think we're all struggling with contemporary political events and with the pandemic, and it's, I mean, to me, one of the, I mean, there's so much going on, right? Climate to, but let me just, one of the interesting things that did come out from the pandemic, and it must be the same in many Brazilian contexts. And here it was, I mean, because we had a very different experience from other parts of the world, in a sense, because Australia could kind of isolate itself, which of course has a lot of echoes with how Australia has operated with strong borders, right? Which has been a highly discriminatory immigration policies and so on, and putting people on islands offshore and saying, we control our borders, even though we sign up to international treaties and so on, right? But Australia had a very different experience from other parts of the world because of that possibility, and that had all sorts of implications for people not being able to travel. I mean, I myself was stuck outside Australia for 6 months. I couldn't return. You're just out. I was in Europe and I couldn't come back for 6 months. You just, and it's very difficult, actually. It's very stressful. You just can't get flights. You're just stuck. But it's had bigger implications. And also you can see how it's played out in terms of, people of different backgrounds. There was a clear kind of discriminatory position on Australians in India not being able to return, so that one of the things from the pandemic was it shed light on a range of issues about who does the work in different ways, and so when we had we had a kind of clear period earlier this year with Australia actually kind of gets to the point where we say, okay, we've got 5 infections there, right, and that's it, right, and then there was a new eruption of COVID in Sydney, and it occurred through an airport driver, so you've always got this. There's always going to be an escape of COVID coming back, because you've got some flights, someone driving an airport car gets infected, and it spreads. At first, it spread in the eastern suburbs. I'll come back to what that means, and there was sort of a kind of worry, partial lockdown. Then it went to the west. And what that revealed very clearly, and I think this has been going on in many places, right? And there was a lot of arguments, right, then, because then we kind of went into partial lockdown, and people saying, well, why aren't people in the eastern suburbs locked down? Because they say, no, we're going to lock down the west, right? Sydney. Now that's about Sydney's geography. The east is kind of the seaboard, the wealthier suburbs, the kind of white suburbs. The west is kind of the big hinterland. And what you could see, and in a sense, part of the argument was, well, that people in the east can work at home, right? They've got home jobs. They can work in their homes. They can do all this stuff. People in the west are in construction, health work, range of places they have to move, and that's why the COVID is spreading, right? And so it shed this light on they've also in big families. They're kind of going back and forth between families. They're living in closer proximity. They're using public transport. You think, okay, we're finally seeing, very clearly how the city is made up, who does what work, how it's divided in unequal lines, where the jobs are being lost, who can maintain the jobs, who's actually making more money during the pandemic, and so on. So amid all the other politics we've got that are going on, the pandemic's been very interesting in a problematic way of shedding light on a range of issues. I mean, there's the other issue that I was also thinking about it when Lynn was talking earlier about the sort of skepticism and so on in critical theory. And there's this other side of conspiracy theories. And I think it's another thing we need to do a lot of thinking about, like, how does critical work that's skeptical relate to conspiracy theories that are also skeptical, right? Saying, we want our freedom. We shouldn't have to be vaccinated. We shouldn't have to wear masks. We think this is actually a government conspiracy, blah, 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 right? And you think, it's sort of, where does that relate to critical theory? And we need to do some more thinking about some of this stuff. And some of that goes back, there's a very interesting paper by Bruno Latour raising this question of what are we doing in critical theory in relation to questions of truth and so on, and we need to reclaim some of that. Anyway, so I mean, I could get it. There's so much going on politically. Your question was partly about how does this relate to language education? Well, it sheds a lot of light again on questions of inequality in cities, in countries, and how I mean, all of us engaged in more broadly in the humanities and so on need to be engaged with all these questions, right? It's brought them out again, and it's sort of shed a stronger light, and we kind of need to seize that moment a bit, because it was, I mean, I was interested in how this, you know, part of this discussion was about sort of multilingualism, you know, and that, well, you know, why hadn't services been provided better multilingually? Why hadn't government engaged with those communities to say, actually, don't be afraid of vaccination, but you know, it's no good putting out a message, a kind of patronizing message in English or maybe in a few other languages. You need to engage with communities who are worried about police, right? Because you started getting policing of particular areas of Sydney. And people say, well, then it's okay. It's just the police to make sure you're following lockdown rules. And people say, well, we're afraid of police. You know, police are a threat to us. And you think, right? Yes. I mean, it depends where you are in the city, what your background is, what your languages are. So it made that clearer, right? In a sense, there's an opportunity to kind of seize part of that moment and say, this is what's going on, and we need to take this up while it's in the public view. Because once things, well, assuming things settle and, you know, we get back to some kind of new normal, as they say, those things will disappear from the broader conscience, and we'll be struggling again to make them more evident to a public, and to look at what language education and so on mean in these contexts, who has access, you know, because the other thing we saw was, like, particularly when schools were out and that the different people had access to computers, internet, means of communication, and so on. And this was, of course, very unequally distributed again. So some people whose parents were homeschooling and have good internet in the East, you know, it was kind of annoying because their kids are at home, but it's all doable, right? In the West, where you've got people working multiple shifts and having to work multiple shifts, that also was revealed, right? Well, you know, why was this security guard at a hotel also delivering pizzas at the weekend? Well, think about it. Like, why is that person doing that, right? It's not because that person, you know, has some massive investment in becoming wealthy. It's because they need to, right? You're not paying those people. You're not paying the nurses. They're also working. You know, why was this person working a shift at this hospital and then at another? Well, obviously we know why. And then they're struggling because they've got kids who need to be homeschooled. And, you know, I mean, all that's come out. We need to kind of keep it on the agenda because it's become part of our context. We could talk about higher education, which has, you know, gone through massive problematic changes, right? We've in Australia, in a sense, like, the government has used this opportunity to screw the universities, right? They just said, okay, I mean, the government kind of provided large-scale job support for certain domains. It just said universities, no, nothing. So we've shed huge numbers of jobs, massive numbers of people have left the university, including myself, right? They kind of said, you know, we'll offer you a package and you can go. And you knew that if you didn't take it, they were going to turn around, which they've done this year, and say, okay, well, all of those of you who didn't take the package, now you can go anyway. So yeah, we've lost huge numbers of people from the university sector. And, you know, and that was, you know, the government kind of wanted that, right? Because they see universities as kind of a threat, as too much public money. I mean, most of our universities have been public, but semi-public, because the government then refuses to fund them anyway. So they have to get money from international students. Then international students stop coming. They've got no money. And so they haven't handled that well either. They've just kind of shed people, and, you know, they've still got all their buildings and whatever else. But so yes, there's all sorts of implications of the pandemic, and they give us a lot of critical agendas we should be taking up in education, humanities, language education more generally. I could talk for house. But.
No, and very interesting, very similar context, but very different at the same time, because in Brazil we have this I'm not even going to mention this president, but it's the whole situation of this radical, outright, whatever government altogether. It's not just the president, but all of them together running this country, right? So, Lynn, passing on to the challenge now.
Well, not so much of a challenge, right? Nothing very challenging in talking about our political situation. But I think our present political situation, which goes back, 3 years, and the pandemic have been very important for us in the humanities, because I think in the last decade, we have been too comfortable in the humanities, sitting on our laurels, thinking that, everything is the way that we wanted it to be, right? Social justice for everyone, equality for everyone. All of these things which are under the surface were not so apparent to us, and they are challenging now. This is what's challenging to us in the humanities, to see the pandemic made it very clear how prevalent social inequalities are everywhere and at various levels, right? And here, this is important for language education as well, because I think, Danielle, you mentioned language and politics. I don't think they can be separated, right? Because, and here, using the French philosopher Jacques Rancière's concept of politics as a distribution of sensitivities or sensibilities, meaning, what makes one political group a group is because they share the same things about what's nice, what's good, what's beneficial to our health, what's nice to do, what isn't, all of these things, like what gives us pleasure, what we consider to be beautiful, etc. So Rancière says that politics is always aesthetic, because the way we relate to the world is what separates us from other groups and also provokes conflicts with these other groups with which we have to live in the same space. Right? And politics is this: living together, belonging to different groups, right? So politics is this essentially conflictual relationship, right? It's not about who's going to be at the top and who's going to be at the bottom. It's about surviving together, right? And surviving together doesn't mean overcoming our differences. It means learning to live together. And I'd already mentioned the Belgian philosopher Isabelle Stengel, what she calls cosmopolitics, of living together in the same space, which is not a geographical space. It's this, let's say, this aesthetic, intellectual space. She says the important thing for living together, or I would say the important political aspect is frightening or shaking our certainties, right? So if we come to this space of coexistence with certainties, then we are going to either eliminate ourselves or eliminate someone else. So the important thing in politics is understanding that there is none of us are complete in our needs and our values. We are always interconnected and learning. And I think this is what we've seen Alastair's mentioned this, what we've seen in the pandemic, the same thing we've seen here. Whilst we were all in lockdown, if you remember the weeks we were in lockdown, we did all our shopping and all our pizzas came delivered to our doors. By whom? Right? By people, the poor, who were exposing themselves to the pandemic, or the people who had to take public transport, whilst we could all be in our own private cars, not being exposed to contamination, right? And this was so clear to us in the pandemic. Or the fact of teachers teaching remotely at home, right? There were differences. Those teachers who happened to be women, happened to be in our case, majority were women, who are at home being mothers, wives, and teaching at the same time, right? Had to survive. And the way they survived, I've talked about this before, those that managed to survive were the ones who started to make contacts and with their colleagues in similar situations and started to exchange experiences, advice, suggestions, materials amongst themselves. So those that managed to mobilize amongst themselves did better than those who didn't. Right? Those who depended on an external structure for orientation, for help, just had great difficulty in surviving. Right? Now, so these were what the pandemic showed us is how unequal we are, how different we are in terms of some of us are better equipped than others. And at a world level, right? Alastair talked about the difference between those that do and those that benefit from the doing, right? Look at the production of the vaccines, where they're produced and who consumes them, right? And the absurdity of the fact that, right, only until last week, Europe would not accept Brazilians who had our most common vaccine, the CoronaVac, right? Because it was Chinese, right? Even though in the state of Sao Paulo, we have one of the highest vaccination rates in the world, higher than Britain or Europe, they would not accept us, right? This made it clear we can talk about decolonial theory and post-colonialism and everything, but injustice, hierarchy, inequality is still there. These are things which I think the positive side to this is that we in the humanities, we have to continue looking at this. Right? And
Great.
in language, it shows us, where it's not a question simply of questioning normativity. And here in Brazil, we have a whole discussion of, we have things like, Alastair just explained to you, Carolina de Jesus, one of our Black female writers who only had 2 years of formal education and wrote from the perspective of a poor Black woman in a favela. And her work was published, and there was a recent edition of her work maintaining the original written Portuguese with all, with all the characteristics of her social class, her gender, etc. And then we had a wonderful colleague of ours from the humanities, I won't say which area, in a neighboring university, a state university, a very prestigious university, criticizing the fact that the publisher didn't correct her Portuguese. I mean, these are the kind of absurdities in the name of furthering the interests of normativity in language. Another discussion we have in Brazil is of the neuter gender, right? There's a movement in Brazil where young people are trying to, there's a movement to not make a distinction between masculine and feminine in our adjectives, right? So we put a neutral E instead of an O and A. Now, the whole discussion on this is that this should be the norm, everybody should do this, or nobody should do this, right? I think it's neither. It's the fact that language is changing. Language reflects different community interests and needs. So these are things which have to feed into our language classes, right? This is what we have to consider. It's not saying this is the new norm. We don't want a fixed norm. We always need a norm, because if we don't share the minimal structure, we won't understand each other. But that structure is constantly changing. It's constantly being contaminated. Now, it's this dynamic of the same and the different that we need to bring into our language classes, also in terms of languages, right? In Brazil, Alastair, for a decade, we had in our official school system, 2 foreign languages could be taught, and it was the school or the community that could choose which foreign languages. Now we've gone to the national curriculum in the last 2 years, which says only English, right? So are we going backwards? Are we going forwards? Whose interests are being represented, right? And the people who say only English in the national curriculum use, to defend themselves, say they are speaking from a lingua franca perspective. Now, how does a lingua franca perspective combine with one language only? Yeah. Oh, wow.
Two comments. The first one, this reminds me of that interview that I had with you, and it was published. I'm going to post it here in the chat. This about research,
Heterogeneity.
educational policies, conversations about heterogeneity and normativity. And another thing that reminds me of this conversation are all about these differences. It's a very short book by Souza Santos, The Cruel Pedagogy of the Virus, in which he's talking about like all of this, they have always existed, and our problems with colonialism, patriarchy, and what is the other? The triad: colonialism, patriarchy,
Capitalism.
and capitalism. So all of this reminds me of this conversation we're having. Guys, I'm going to start asking the questions from the audience. And so I have this comment here from Lucas Rigonato, and another comment from Lucas is in Brazil, Michele Cristiano is in Australia, and then the question, okay? So many in the academia are not interested in a destabilization, let's say, of the status quo, even if it means maintaining inequality in society as it is. And then I'm going to go for Michelle. Hi, Michelle. So nice to see you from Australia. And she said, as a Brazilian living and researching in Australia, I feel that applied linguistics here isn't very critical. And it's certainly very colonial and monolingual, especially in ESL university centers. And then the question that I think that has to do with this comes from Camila House, Professors Lynn and Pennycook. What would you say are the main differences between critical theory, according to the perspectives you're explaining now, and decolonial theory? So what are the possible dialogues, let's say? Who wishes to start?
Okay. And we probably need to answer these a bit quicker, don't we? How long have we got?
We've got 4 minutes. No, we can like 10 minutes. We've got 10 minutes to finish. Yeah.
Oh God. Okay, quick. Yeah, and the question of destabilization. Yeah, I mean, people in secure jobs are often not interested in destabilizing that. I mean, and it goes this whole problem, and this has been critiqued itself, of course, of the radical intellectual, the so-called radical intellectual who can, has a stable job. And I've been reflecting. I was pushed actually when I was doing my rewriting my critical applied linguistics book, and people talking, and I was writing a bit, and then some of the reviews wanted me to push a bit more on these questions around the changing notion of labor, right? Casualization, and saying, it was, and I've been reflecting quite a bit on that now, that it was and still is much easier for me to write about critical applied linguistics having a tenured professorial job than for staff now who are in casualized work. I mean, one, it's just harder to write. You don't have the time, you don't have the work set up. So, to write about critical stuff has become, I think, much harder. Casualization means you don't have the means to do that. I mean, it means you're also not trying to maintain a fixed job because you haven't got one. But that sort of that question of who's going to do it, and yeah, for so many people, they're not interested in destabilizing the status quo because ultimately, they're part of it. And that goes also to the much bigger question of the global South and who's writing. And, we need to kind of question a lot of this stuff. Like people are saying, okay, I mean, one is the problem of the geographical and the geopolitical, right? And it kind of frustrates me when I have, colleagues in Australia kind of say, oh, we in the global South. I say, I don't think you are, right? And one, Australia kind of generally isn't. Two, you sitting in your university job in here, you're white, you're not the global South. I'm not the global South. I'm part of the problem of how it's maintained, right, of the North, right? So we need to kind of get at those questions. Second, oh yeah, this question about applied linguistics is applied linguistics critical in Australia? I mean, yeah, I mean, there's a lot that isn't, and we've had the problem in part that critical literacy had a very strong presence here, but was also very formulated in a very particular way about teaching the language of the powerful, right? So there's this critique of Freirean pedagogy that said that's about student voice. I mean, it was kind of parodied a bit, saying it's all about letting people speak and student voice. Part of how it got taken up in sort of North American individualistic ideas of the critical. Here it got taken up as, okay, we've got to teach powerful genres, which was also quite problematic. It became more like a transmissive pedagogy. So we've had critical areas, but the particular question also raised ESL in university centers. And yeah, I mean, that also goes to the global ELT market, which I think Danielle also just kind of referred to there, right? In the way that this gets, it's got its own economy, ideologies, and so on. And so you get, Australian universities have been very able to market themselves as, not necessarily overtly as English language universities. I mean, I made a move, actually talked to our vice chancellor a year or so ago and say, a couple of years ago, and say, couldn't we name ourselves as a multilingual university? And it was kind of, oh, that's really interesting. And then they kind of think, yeah, but that's not how we sell ourselves to China, is it? And so, yes, I mean, it's hard to talk about critical applied linguistics or applied linguistics generally across Australia, but particularly when you're looking at like university English language centers or the ELICOS, that's a particular, I won't go into it, kind of English center, intensive English center. Yeah, they're very conservative. They're just working as a service industry and saying, yes, we're going to teach you the academic norms. We're going to teach you English to survive. They're not questioning it. And we always have to push to change that, but it's difficult. So it's those areas. And it's interesting, I think, to reflect on that, how when you see English language teaching in the context of universities and other things, they reproduce these normative ideas constantly. That's an assemblage of language, pedagogy, interests, ideologies, and so on. The third question, critical and decolonial theory. I mean, I just, as Lynn Marrow has been stressing, we need to talk about decolonial theories and critical theories too. I mean, I think that critical, I would say you could put decolonial theories as critical theories as part of a bigger umbrella carefully, because you might not want to, because critical theory has a particular lineage that might see as a kind of colonial move to include decolonial theories within colonial theories. But I think, I think we shouldn't see them as oppositional, different. They've been different ways of framing things. I think the decolonial moment seems to arrive through a number of different pushes, and of course it's already been critiqued of being a new buzzword, and there's been quite a strong pushback against decoloniality. But I think it's got a strength. It's a whole area, focusing on colonialism, bringing in racism, linking to the idea of the global South, that's pushing critical theory more generally in a very strong and useful direction. I see them as kind of allied sets of ideas working around each other. Right now, I think the decolonial has a particular strength, and we should kind of ride with it, because it gives us a strong means to raise issues that this gives us some of the best ways to do it. And as Lynn Marrow said, it's very different too, right? This isn't, there was a problem with critical theory. It tended to kind of have this lineage back through to the Frankfurt School and other things, right? Where decolonial theory has to be understood as theories. There's the South American, which has been very strong set of ideas, but certainly all the stuff happening in Africa and also Asia. And as Lynn Marrow said, also there's different stuff in like Eastern Europe, where decolonial theory becomes a kind of a different thing altogether. And I guess, yeah, that becomes too broad and so many different things, but it's important, and it's a kind of different way of doing critical work, a very significant one right now. Enough.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I was going to mention that it's been very discussed from the Latin American perspectives, even in English and together with the Spanish language, Portuguese, English language. So all these languages all together as well, right? Reminds me of that conversation you had with Mignolo, Lynn, about the English. And then they were talking, Alastair, about the fact there was a decolonial event and speaking English, forgetting that Portuguese is a very colonizing language as well. And okay, Lynn, let's go.
Okay, I think we have to, when we talk about critique, we have to remember that the dominant, let's say, economic, cultural, academic paradigm which we're living under at the moment is neoliberalism. And in this paradigm, it is not the truth that is important, far from it. It's the market that's important, right? So everything is in terms of the market. So what we do has got to be profitable. Universities have to be profitable. Everything has to be profitable, right? And minimum investment for the maximum profit, right? So this will even affect, it has become so penetrating in all aspects of society, it even affects how we learn languages. I'll only learn a language if it's more profitable, right? Or as Alastair was saying, why should Australian universities call themselves multilingual? If it's more profitable, they can get more students from China if they say they're monolingually in English. Canada has the same problem. So I think we've got to, when we talk about criticality, we've got to remember the paradigm we're working under, which simply ignores any concept of critique, right? So we have to, on one hand, push for a change in the neoliberal paradigm. There are many people who thought that, oh, leave it alone, it will through entropy, it'll work itself out. It hasn't. It's been, Foucault spoke about it in the 1980s, right? 40 years later, we're still in it, right? So we have to take it seriously. We have to confront it seriously. But how? That's the problem. I have been involved in half a dozen international bids for research funding, which have all tried to diminish, which have all been critical, but have tried to diminish their critical language. But obviously you can't remove it, right? None of them were accepted because these are all in countries which are dominated by the neoliberal paradigm. What have you got to contribute? What has your project got to contribute to our nation? Basically, that's the question, right? So I think the issue of being critical has to be taken into account. What are we offering? And secondly, about decoloniality, Alastair mentioned the geographical and the epistemological aspects of it, the geopolitical aspects. The one thing we have to remember is that there is a difference between a social location from which we speak, right, and an epistemic or political location. So just the fact that we are located in Brazil, which is in the south, with a history of injustice and colonization, doesn't make us decolonial, right? Here in São Paulo, this is the capital of coloniality in Brazil, right? The neoliberal capital of coloniality. And so we have to, one of the things we do learn from various forms of decolonial theory is the importance of situatedness, or the extreme importance of putting an end to universalization, to generalization and universalization. Now, with this, I'd just like to remind our listeners that in terms of Latin American, just to give an example, in terms of Latin American decolonial theory, and I'm not talking about the other forms of decolonial theory, Latin American decolonial theory, there are extreme differences. Ramon Grossfogel wrote an article where he criticizes two of the big names in Latin American decolonial theory, Walter Mignolo, the Argentinian Walter Mignolo, and the Peruvian Aníbal Quijano. Right? and he says these people have become great decolonial thinkers, but they are not using their own ideas, and they don't say whose ideas have influenced them. Right? So they speak as if their ideas are theirs without giving due recognition to the others, which is a colonial posture, if you like, right? The Bolivian decolonial thinker Silvia Cusicanqui says something similar, right? And she will even say that we can't generalize, universalize decolonial theory as being anti-market, anti-capitalist, because one of the essential aspects of indigenous Bolivian culture was the marketplace. Bolivian, that's right, Bolivian indigenous communities were not just agricultural, their survival depended on taking their goods and selling them in a marketplace to each other, right? So, and that goes for before colonization, right? So to put an end, to generalize the fact that capitalism, and here she was referring to Boaventura, Souza Santos, to say that capitalism was part of coloniality is not necessarily true, right? So the important thing of situatedness is that it's never ending, right? I'm not the same person that I was yesterday, right? So the idea is, please, as Fernando Henrique, our former president, said, please don't read what I wrote 20 years ago, right? I would say the same thing. You know, there are things we've gone beyond this, right? So I think there are things that we can learn from decolonial theory. It's not always the same, and just because you're from the South doesn't mean you think in a Southern fashion. In the same way, just because you're from the global North doesn't make you colonial.
Definitely. Lynn, this is why I have made this provocation about my S. I've been saying this philosophical S as decolonialities, and I've been insisting on this S in every term that I've been using, because it needs to be pluralized, at least for people to understand that perhaps we're not talking about the same decolonial process. And also we are studying Rita Segato, with Luciana's bringing Rita Segato to our GEELLE group. Guys, it's about time to
Can I just
finish.
say something there about
Yes.
on the philosophical aspect of the plural? One of the critiques I've made about multiliteracies in the past,
and literacy as well. Yeah.
I insist on talking about literacy and not multiliteracies in the plural, because for me, literacy is a phenomenon, and what I learned from the indigenous literacies, which are not plural, how they interpret the relationship between language and writing in different ways. So for me, literacy is this phenomenon of connecting language and modes of writing, right? If we use literacies in the plural, as many people do, it seems that we simply we generate this machine which produces different kinds of literacy as if they have nothing in common.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
The same thing I would say about decoloniality. We have to remind people that they are different forms, but they're referring to a critique of coloniality, which is what they have in common.
Okay. Well, thank you, guys. Alastair, final words. We are over time. Sorry, Alastair. We passed like 10, 13 minutes. Final words to our Brazilian teachers, future teachers, researchers.
Look, I've seen so many other questions coming up in the chat, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to more. Lynn, Mario, and I kind of got onto talking too much probably, but look, it's been great. I would like to hear from more, and I'm sorry if I know also people may want some ideas of more direct ideas for language education. That's often difficult to do, and I'm often quite reluctant to try and suggest, from being in Australia in such a different context and not being kind of directly involved in language education now, to be careful about making suggestions for the implications. But I realize that also looks like a a denial of my responsibility in other ways. So I apologize for that. There's often a tension when we're talking applied linguistics in broad things, but it seems, it's great this is happening. Thank you for organizing this. Thanks. I don't know how many people are out there listening, but I've seen a lot of stuff happening on the chat, and it looks like this is a very engaged forum, which is great. This is what we need, is people engaged and talking about this. And apologies that I guess my presence has forced this to be in English. I can pick up some bits of the Portuguese, but not enough to speak. I can read bits, but so I've sorry about that too. It might be easier in Portuguese, but people seem to be able to follow all this too, which congratulations to everyone for that. It's quite a demand. So. Thank you.
We thank you so much, Alastair. I always like to say, people question me, how you do an event in English and then in Portuguese, and I'll keep doing it. We are from the English department. We also have to fight for the language we teach. We have beautiful language we teach. So I always insist. And of course, there are many things that I'd like to do with including the sign languages. This would be nice. And maybe we will do the translation to Portuguese with all the videos if we get funding, because funding in Brazil is almost impossible. But anyways, Lynn, final words. Thank you, Lynn.
Just thank you, Danielle, for promoting these opportunities. Thank you, Alastair, for accepting the invitation, and thank you, Luciana, for with Danielle coordinating the whole thing. And thank you for the public. Thank you for the public. Who put up with us speaking so much.
Yes. Lou, would you like to say your final words?
I would just like to tell the speakers, we had over 100 people connected, and we had over 40 questions, which is pretty impressive. We'll forward you the questions as well. So thank you very much. And all those of you who are still watching us, please contact GEELLE Group if you like. We are holding our sessions online, and we have people from all over Brazil, right, Danielle? So
yes,
the more the merrier. So thank you so much, Alastair and Lynn. It was a pleasure, and thank you, Danielle.
Thank you, Luciana. Guys, we have to finish. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. It's a kind of event that I like, because it's all about conversations, learning from each other, and we see each other next year. This is over. We're done with events this year and lives. So we see each other next year in 2022 for the 4th cycle of talks. Alastair, Lynn, gratidão. Obrigado. Thank you very much. Thank you, guys. Obrigado. See you next time. Thank you.